What's gaming, gamers? Today, I'm going to be attempting to solo flawless the Spire of the Watcher dungeon using a randomly selected exotic armor piece to center the build around. As solo flawlessing dungeons usually requires at least a decent build, I won't be doing a full loadout randomizer. However, if that's something you'd like to see, I may try it out in the future. If you'd like to know why I've chosen Spire of the Watcher over the newest dungeon, Ghosts of the Deep, I'll quickly explain my reasons now. First, Ghosts of the Deep isn't exactly a hard solo flawless, but it requires more out of your loadout than Spire of the Watcher does. Ghosts has much more severe DPS checks, and if you're not hitting decent damage, you'll be in the run for a couple of hours. It also needs you to be very survivable, as there are a lot of sources of burst damage, which is an issue when using random builds. For these reasons, I've chosen Spire of the Watcher as the dungeon I'll be attempting when using the randomizer, as I believe it to alleviate both of those major concerns of mine. Now I'll get into the rule set I'll be following for these runs. First, I must use whatever random exotic is chosen from the pool of all of the exotics. Loadout swapping is permitted so long as the exotic itself isn't removed. Second, the build must make use of the exotic's perk. For example, if I am playing Hunter and roll Shinobu's Vow, I must use the Arc subclass with the skip grenades chosen. Third, if the exotic chosen doesn't require a specific subclass, I must randomize the subclass chosen. As an example, if I am playing Titan and roll Heart of Inmost Delight, then I must use a randomizer to choose one of the 5 subclasses for use in the run. Fourth and finally, any weapon chosen must have the same affinity as the subclass required of the run. If the exotic armor piece requires a specific type of weapon, any affinity weapon of that type can be chosen. I really wanted 5 rules because 5 is a cooler number than 4, but I couldn't think of a sufficient 5th rule, so if you have any other ideas for rules or restrictions you think would make the challenge more interesting, please leave them in the comments. Now, I'll briefly explain why I've chosen the rules I have in case it's not clear. For the first rule, using whatever exotic armor piece is randomly chosen is a given, as that's what the whole video is about. As for loadout swapping, I allowed this because each encounter is different, and I may want to change armor mods around between encounters or before damage phases depending on what the build is. For the second rule, enforcing the use of the exotic's perk is simply to make the build more interesting. It wouldn't be a challenge if I rolled the Helm of Saint 14 on my Titan and then just use Solar Titan because it's easy, thus the second rule is required. For the third rule, randomizing the subclass for exotics that don't require a specific subclass is simply to spice it up a little bit. It wouldn't be fun if I just ran Void every time I rolled a Hunter exotic that didn't require a specific subclass because it's easy, so enforcing a random subclass should make the builds, and by extension the runs, more interesting. For the fourth rule, I am requiring synergistic affinity weapons for the purposes of loadout variety. It wouldn't be interesting if I just ran Leviathan's Breath for every single run, so this rule makes it such that I can only run Leviathan's Breath with the Void subclass. As for the logistics of the challenge itself, only 3 attempts at soloing the dungeon will be given so as to save myself time and allow myself to actually make the video. However, only deaths will count as run failures. Game crashes, error codes, and other unforeseen circumstances will not be considered run failures, and any run ended in these ways will be wiped from the record books. This does mean that some videos will have me not complete the run, but I feel as if that makes it such that each video is unique and isn't simply a completion guide with a randomized loadout. With that said, I'll now go over the exotic I was gifted with for this video. I've got the wheel spinning on screen, and on the wheel is every single hunter exotic in the game. Each time I roll an exotic, that exotic will be removed from the rotation so as to ensure it isn't rolled again. This video will be using the exotic chest piece Omnioculus. Now, I'll detail my plans for the build before we get into the first attempt at a solo flawless clear. For the subclass, as Omnioculus uses Void Invisibility, I'll be using the Void subclass for this challenge. I'll be using the Deadfall super for the Harpy boss fight, and the Mobius Quiver super for the rest of the run. I'll be running the Gambler's Dodge for my class ability, as it'll instantly refund my melee ability, allowing me to be invisible for longer to take advantage of the 50% damage resist granted by Omnioculus. I've decided to take the Vortex Grenade, as I find it to be a very good grenade for dealing a decent amount of damage to enemies that are grouped up. For the aspects, I'll be running Trapper's Ambush first to allow the Smoke Bomb to make me invisible. As Omnioculus grants a second melee charge, my thought is that Trapper's Ambush will allow me to be invisible for longer. Furthermore, Trapper's Ambush comes with a Quickfall ability which will weaken and blind targets when they're caught in the Quickfall's blast, allowing them to be dealt with more ease. The second aspect will be Vanishing Step, as that will allow the Gambler's Dodge to make me invisible as well. Vanishing Step will increase the total amount of time I can stay invisible, in turn increasing my chances of survivability if I need to get to a safe location. For the fragments, first I'll be running the Echo of Harvest fragment. Echo of Harvest should allow me to summon more Orbs of Power and more Void Breaches, which will increase both my super and class ability regeneration. As the Quickfall melee ability will weaken targets, I can weaken enemies effectively on demand, allowing for a very high uptime on the creation of Orbs and Void Breaches. Furthermore, the Seasonal Artifact will help me with weakening enemies, but more on that shortly. Next, I'll run Echo of Persistence. Echo of Persistence will increase the durations of all 3 void buffs applied to me, those being Invisibility, Overshield, and Devour. I'll be able to proc all 3 void buffs using this build in conjunction with the seasonal artifact, so Echo of Persistence seems like it'll be a no-brainer. The third fragment I'll be using is Echo of Remnants. Echo of Remnants will simply increase the linger duration of the Vortex Grenade, which will help its overall damage output. Lastly, the fourth fragment will be Echo of Starvation. Echo of Starvation will grant me the Devour buff after having picked up either an Orb of Power or a Void Breach, which will help survivability immensely. With my tentative subclass build now detailed, I'll go over a few seasonal artifact mods that will be helping this build significantly. Firstly, the Unto the Breach mod will cause the defeat of any Void debuffed target to summon a Void Breach. This will help with my class ability regeneration significantly, as well as my survivability, with the Void Breach granting me the Devour buff as well. Next, the Protective Breach mod will grant me a full 45 HP Overshield upon the collection of any Void Breach, which means Void Breaches grant even more survivability. On top of giving me the Devour buff because of Echo of Starvation, they'll also grant me a full Overshield upon collection. Lastly, the Supernova mod will cause the next source of Void damage after having picked up a Void Breach to summon a Weakening Pulse, weakening any enemy within its blast. As I should be collecting Void Breaches frequently, I'll constantly have the ability to apply this weaken effect to enemies. For the Armors mods, I won't go into detail as to why I've chosen everything I have because I don't want this video to be too long. I will, however, show to you now exactly what I plan to use. On my helmet, I'll be running 3 Harmonic Siphon mods. On my arms, I'll have 2 melee kickstart mods and a firepower mod. On my chest piece, I've gone with 2 void resistance mods and a concussive dampener. On my legs, I'll be running an absolution mod, an invigoration mod, and a recuperation mod. Lastly, on my cloak, I'll have an outreach mod and 2 reaper mods. Now, I'll go over my plans for a weapon loadout. In my kinetic slot, the plan is to run my Riptide with chill clip and autoloading holster for the opening and first encounters to deal with the conduit minotaurs faster. For the second encounter, I'll be swapping this out to a Pugilist Subsistence Prolonged Engagement SMG, and I'll go back to my chill clip Riptide for the final boss fight. In the energy slot, my plan is to run my Swashbuckler Pugilist the Title SMG for the entire run, as it should allow me to regenerate both my dodge ability and melee ability faster. The Title's origin trait, Class D Contender, grants 5% class ability energy on getting a kill, and Pugilist will grant 10% melee ability energy every kill, which should make my invisibility uptime that much higher. For the Harpy boss fight, I'll swap this out for a Lead from Gold Repulsor Brace Hollow Denial Trace Rifle, as it should make dealing with the Harpy's eyes much faster, allowing for more time to deal damage. In my heavy slot, for the first encounter, I'll be running Commemoration, as it's a very good machine gun and will simply melt enemies very quickly. For the second encounter, I will be running the Leviathan's Breath Exotic Bow for damage, as I feel it'll do a significant amount of damage. If it ends up being poor for damage against the Harpy, I'll swap to a triple-tapped Frenzy Taipan 4FR Linear Fusion Rifle. For the final boss fight, I'll be using the Two-Tailed Fox Exotic Rocket Launcher, as it does a high amount of damage and applies both the Scorch and Jolt effects for extra damage. Now to go over the first attempt at solo flawlessing Spire of the Watcher with Omnioculus. The intro encounter went without a hitch, barring my poor memory forgetting the order of a couple of the conduit nodes. This encounter isn't hard, and just serves to teach you the main mechanic of the dungeon, which is to get the Arctrician buff from the Minotaurs and connect the nodes. One little tip for this opening encounter: completing the node chain will summon supplicants, so if you don't want to have to deal with supplicants, don't complete the nodes until all 4 of them are ready to be completed. This will prevent supplicants from spawning altogether, as the encounter ends once all 4 node chains have been completed. The jumping puzzle isn't worth going over, I jumped and puzzled all over it, so I'll get into the first actual encounter now. The first encounter, Ascend the Spire, is super simple, and you only have to kill 1 enemy throughout the entire thing. The Conduit Minotaur at the beginning of the encounter needs to be killed to gain the Arctrician buff, but once you've gotten the buff from the first Minotaur, you can carry the buff through the rest of the encounter. Knowing the order of the conduit chains helps with this, but you don't need to know them by heart to get through this encounter safely. Having an Eager Edge sword can help with speed, but my main goal was completion, and I tend to fall off the map when I rely on Eager Edge. I did forget the order of a chain once or twice, but I got through it without any significant difficulty. A quick tip for this encounter as well: if you kill the Hydras that are floating around each of the 3 floors, supplicants will start to spawn on that floor. Refrain from killing the Hydras and you won't have to deal with any supplicants throughout the entire encounter. After completing the first encounter, I was gifted with this Threat Detector Target Lock 7th Seraph Carbine, which I swiftly turned into legendary shards. Now into the meat of the run. The second encounter, the boss fight against Achelous, the Siren's Current. This fight is tedious, as Achelous has a large amount of health, but it's not very difficult. I went into it planning to use Leviathan's Breath as my main source of damage, with the Subsistence Pugilist Prolonged Engagement in my kinetic slot, and a Dragonfly Rangefinder Hollow Denial in my energy slot. The Subsistence Pugilist Prolonged Engagement was supposed to help me deal with the goblins, and to get me melee energy while I did so via the Pugilist perk. Hollow Denial was brought to destroy the eyes of the boss mostly, but it also helped to deal with the floating harpies that were out of range of the SMG. While I was doing the first mechanic phase of activating the fuel rods, I was already doubting the build. For this encounter, I like to take my time at clearing the harpies around the map so as to make the damage phase both safer and easier. However, prolonged engagement wasn't doing the damage I needed it to, and it didn't feel great to use in conjunction with the rest of the build. The Pugilist perk was helpful for regenerating my melee ability, although I didn't find myself needing to use it for that purpose. Subsistence was also a good perk for it, but it was still having a hard time clearing groups of goblins, and just didn't have the range to deal with the harpies that spawned after having activated the first fuel rod. This forced me to use my trace rifle on the harpies, which was one of the reasons I had brought the trace rifle in the first place. But I was worried this would mess with my ammo economy too heavily, preventing me from using the trace rifle on the boss's eyes before damage phase, which was the main reason I decided to bring the trace in the first place. As I completed the first mechanic phase and moved on to the first damage phase, I figured I was in a good spot to do some decent damage. I killed a couple goblins that I had forgotten to kill before I shot the last conduit node and started the damage phase. Using the Deadfall super to tether the boss made dealing with the eyes super easy, and I didn't even have to reload my Hollow Denial before all of its eyes were destroyed. Unfortunately, as the boss moves towards the center of the arena, Deadfall didn't have the enemy tethered as long as I would have liked for actually damaging the boss. But I knew that going into the encounter and wasn't expecting it to. My first blunder of the run was after the damage phase, however. I, for some reason, decided Leviathan's Breath wasn't doing all the damage I had wanted in a single phase. As I watch footage of the run now, I can see this was entirely greed on my part and was not a thought based in reality whatsoever. The damage phase was actually pretty decent and would have put me on pace for a 6 or 7 phase encounter, assuming I was lucky with ammo drops. But as fate would dictate, I swapped it out for a firing line triple tap Taipan linear fusion rifle because I forgot to change the firing line perk to Frenzy at the Enclave before I started the run. As I said, this change was entirely greed on my part, and in my pursuit for the most optimal damage phase I could get, I ended up with less optimal damage phases in the long run. It also didn't help that, on top of forgetting to change my Taipan's perks at the Enclave, I also forgot to infuse it, so it was at 1600 power instead of the pinnacle cap of 1810, and I didn't have any upgrade modules to increase its power. I'm not sure how much a weapon's power level affects its damage, but I was kicking myself at the time for not having remembered to do either of those things. Nothing of note occurred during the second mechanic phase besides this heavy brick almost falling off the map. I walked to the edge assuming it had fallen all the way to the surface of Mars, but to my surprise it landed on a ledge below. I wasn't actually sure if the ledge was safe to jump onto, or if it was outside of the playable area, but I fell to it anyways because the heavy ammo was more important to me than my life. Thankfully, this was within the bounds of the arena, and I continued on towards the damage phase. Starting the damage phase, I had 10 heavy ammo, which I felt was a decent amount for a single phase. Again, I tethered the boss with Deadfall as the damage phase started and destroyed its eyes with my Hollow Denial without needing to reload. Taipan was dealing decent damage, and Triple Tap was granting me extra ammo, but unfortunately I didn't get any procs of the Vice Stinger origin trait and had to manually reload the weapon halfway through the phase. After this damage phase, however, things started to go downhill. Heavy ammo was very scarce. It felt as if more bricks dropped off the map than were collectible. Before I started the third damage phase, I farmed ammo for what felt like an eternity, moving back and forth, killing goblins and minotaurs over and over again ad nauseum. In reality, it was only about 5 minutes, but it was very tedious, and at the end of those 5 minutes, I had no heavy ammo to show for my efforts. So, I swapped my helmet's mods to include 2 heavy ammo finders in a desperate attempt to increase my ammo drops. This was somewhat effective, but after having farmed for a little bit more, I realized it wasn't enough. I decided at this point to change my loadout slightly. With Taipan in my heavy slot, my exotic slot was freed up, and so I swapped out the Prolonged Engagement SMG, which had caused me so much strife for the Monte Carlo exotic auto rifle. Doing this gave me a chance to both use the Dreaming Clarity ornament I had just purchased from the Bright Dust shop, as well as have an increased chance for heavy ammo drops. I didn't want to run a double special loadout with a linear fusion rifle in my heavy slot, as if I ran out of special ammo, I'd have next to nothing to deal with the abundant amount of goblins and harpies around the map, nor anything to shoot the conduit nodes with. Monte Carlo also served to grant me melee energy when killing enemies, which was the only reason I had brought Prolonged Engagement in the first place. This swap proved immensely helpful, and I had a lot more success further into this encounter. The increased damage of the exotic weapon, paired with its increased heavy ammo drop rate, was very helpful for the remainder of the encounter. It also had more range than Prolonged Engagement, making it better equipped to deal with the harpies if I found myself out of trace rifle ammo. After a little bit more ammo farming, I started the third damage phase with full heavy ammo. Consistently destroying the boss's eyes without having to reload helped me get decent damage for this phase, along with Triple Tap's ammo generation and Vice Stinger's reloading capabilities. It's really hard to miss crits on this boss, so triple tap procs constantly, which really helps the ammo economy overall. I ended the phase with ammo left over, which felt really nice, especially after having farmed ammo for about 15 minutes. I had dealt a decent chunk of damage and felt confident going into the rest of the encounter. The fourth mechanic phase was uneventful, but had some decent heavy ammo luck. I got 2 full bricks to drop, but one of them took the word drop too literally and dropped off the side of the map. However, with 1 full brick and a subsequent finder brick I managed to get, I was able to start the 4th damage phase with 13 linear fusion shots. After the 4th damage phase concluded, I decided to change my helmet's mods again. Since I had Monte Carlo to increase my heavy ammo drops, I removed one of the 2 heavy ammo finder mods I had slotted into my helmet in favor of a kinetic siphon mod. This would allow me to collect orbs of power more frequently, which would grant me the Devour buff whenever picked up. Not to pat my own back or anything, but this was a smart idea, allowing me to have the Devour buff up constantly, effectively ensuring my survival throughout the rest of the encounter. After I equipped this kinetic siphon mod, nothing else changed, so I'll skip through the rest of the second encounter. Nothing of consequence happened, and I was able to complete the encounter successfully using the changes to my planned build. The final phase count was 9, which is definitely on the high side, but there were a few damage phases which were less than optimal, leading to the large phase count. The encounter is simple enough and is mostly a test of endurance. As for loot, I was gifted with a Volt Shot Dragonfly Terminus Horizon for my troubles, which didn't really suit my needs, and I dismantled it shortly after the run concluded. The jumping puzzle immediately following this encounter had nothing of importance happen, and I got through it perfectly fine, which leads us into the boss fight against Percy's Primordial Ruin. My planned loadout was to use the Two-Tailed Fox Exotic Rocket Launcher in my heavy slot, as I figured the extra damage granted by the ignitions and jolt effects would help my damage phases. Plus, being a rocket launcher, it's super easy to use and didn't require hitting crits on a boss whose crit spot is minuscule. I had my Chill Clip autoloading holster Riptide in my kinetic slot to help deal with the Hydras and the Conduit Minotaurs, and I used a Swashbuckler Pugilist the Title SMG in my energy slot for general use to help kill the goblins and supplicants. I had decided to change up my helmet's mods a bit as well. Since I was no longer using a kinetic weapon as my main source of ad clear, I could put a harmonic siphon on instead of a kinetic siphon, saving me 1 energy in the helmet. This allowed me to run 2 heavy ammo finders instead of 1, which I was hoping would make up for the loss of drop chance by no longer having an exotic primary to kill enemies with. I'm not sure which of the 2 has a higher chance at dropping heavy, but I didn't really have an issue with heavy ammo, so my assumption is that the 2 finder mods at least did their part. Onto the encounter itself, the first mechanic phase went off without a hitch, barring my poor memory regarding the node chain layouts. I knew that the quick fall ability would help significantly with the supplicants, as it would blind them, preventing them from exploding. And if they were to explode anyways, the ×4 resist granted by Omnioculus would hopefully help me survive anyways. I used this throughout the encounter. If I found myself next to supplicants I knew I couldn't avoid, I used the quick fall ability to prevent them from exploding. This also had the effect of weakening them, which caused them to drop a Void Breach upon death via the Unto the Breach artifact mod, which then, upon collection of that Void Breach, would grant me a 45 HP Void Overshield via the Protective Breach artifact mod. All of these things helped significantly in my survivability during the encounter, and I took full advantage of them wherever I needed to. The first damage phase was mostly a test to see how much damage I could do in one phase. Percy's has a pretty simple damage phase, as he just kind of walks towards you menacingly while shooting at you. This allowed me to hit all of my rockets, as well as my Mobius Quiver Super, to deal a decent amount of damage for the phase. I knew my setup wasn't optimal, as Mobius Quiver isn't exactly a damage super, but I certainly wasn't using Spectral Blades for DPS, and I don't think Deadfall would have helped Two-Tailed Fox deal more damage than Mobius was doing as well. The second mechanic phase had a close call, but was saved by the damage resistance granted when performing a finisher. Other than that, it went the same as the first, and I was able to start the damage phase with almost full heavy ammo. The second damage phase was slightly better than the first, and judging by the health bar, I'd be on pace for about an 8 phase Percy's. 8 phases is a lot of phases, but with how quick the mechanic phase is for Percy's, I was okay with it. The third mechanic phase had a close call right at the beginning, likely being saved by the Void Overshield I was granted after grabbing a Void Breach. I cleaned up my play for the rest of the phase and started the damage phase with 3 rockets and a full super. The next 4 phases went by as expected. A few close calls, saved either by Void Overshields, Devour, Resist ×4, or some combination thereof. Once you've gotten into a rhythm with this boss fight, it's really very simple, and the supplicants are your biggest threat, as 2 of them exploding on you at once can end the run then and there. Skipping to the 8th and penultimate damage phase, I was very close to ending it there. Had I had 5 or 6 rockets instead of 4, I may have been able to end the run this phase, but that wasn't the case. I played this final mechanic phase way safer than I really needed to, but I wasn't about to wipe when Percy's only had a sliver of health left. I knew I wouldn't need much heavy, if any at all, and that my super itself would likely kill Percy's by itself, so I wasn't worried about getting lucky with heavy drops and was working to ensure my super would be up when I needed it. I went into the final damage phase with 3 rockets anyways, and 1 rocket plus my Mobius Quiver Super were more than enough to finish off the minuscule amount of health Perseus had left. Well, it turns out Spire of the Watcher is definitely solo flawlessable with the Omnioculus exotic chest piece. I don't think I'd recommend this build in particular if you were going for a solo flawless of your own, because at least with the restrictions I followed, damage phases are plenty and that makes for a long, tedious run. With better weapon choices, both bosses could have been knocked down to probably 6 phases, but I can't see it going much lower than that without a better damage super, and you're not going to get one on Void Hunter. My final time ended up being 1 hour, 29 minutes, 22 seconds, so it wasn't really that bad. I did end up beating it on my first attempt, and that was likely due to the fact the Void Hunter has been my main class-subclass combination since I started playing Destiny, so I'm very comfortable with it. I had never used Omnioculus specifically, as I'd always been of the opinion that there were better exotic options, but this build was very good for survivability, and it effectively made it impossible to die while going invisible. But that's all for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, comments, or criticisms, please leave them in the comments. I read them all and reply to as many as I can. If you have any ideas for alternative rules and restrictions for this challenge as well, please let me know in the comments. Thank you again for watching, and have a great day!